Hi, everybody. I'm just waiting for a few more people to load in and get on, and then we'll start. Sorry for the slightly delayed start. We had just a few January technical difficulties. Okay. So my name's Alison Symington. I chair the Breakfast Knowledge and Networking Committee for LSO and sit on the LSO board. I want to say Happy New Year to all of you. It's great that you're all here. And we've got an exciting program for you today, so I don't want to take up too much time. We're going to introduce the speakers as we enter into the moderation session. And really today our focus is really to talk about what the industry can do to look at the sentiment, shift the sentiments around medical, the use of medical cannabis with the community, with patients, with so that we can get to an enhanced delivery of a health benefit. So what I'm going to do today is start it off by asking Chris Delvecchio, who also sits on the Breakfast Committee, but is a principal at Shift Health, to give us some color as to where we currently are based on a paper that Shift Health just released, I believe this week or last week. So Chris, last week. So Chris, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, Alison. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Delvecchio. As Alison said, I'm principal at Shift Health. We're a strategy consultancy that's focused on the health research and innovation system. And we've been serving the pharmaceutical industry for more than 2 decades. And we feel that this experience and that pharma mindset and the best practices that pharma applies in product development was really valuable to the development of cannabis-based pharmaceuticals and enhancing their benefits. So I want to just start today's discussion by putting forward some of our thoughts to set the stage for the conversation with our expert panelists. So I'll share my screen and walk through just a few slides for about 10 minutes before opening up the discussion. And I'm going to just turn my video off for the presentation just so I don't lose connection. So since the legalization of medical and recreational cannabis, for that matter, we've witnessed a real dramatic increase in the level of research in this field, supporting the notion that cannabis can offer therapeutic benefit for conditions like chronic pain, epilepsy, spasticity, anxiety, and just to name a few, but there are others listed on the screen here. But this has largely been done with and observed through the use of medical cannabis. And I refer to medical cannabis as the more traditional products that have not necessarily been associated with rigorous health claims, and they haven't necessarily gone through rigorous clinical testing. And that's in contrast to cannabis-based pharmaceuticals, where we would refer to a very specific product that has gone under rigorous clinical testing to demonstrate safety and efficacy and outcomes for a particular condition in order to garner regulatory approval and support specific health claims and use in a particular setting. So just a couple of definitions to keep in mind there. But the full potential of cannabis isn't really being realized, in my opinion. It's largely because of a lack of rigorous clinical evidence. And yes, there have been clinical studies underway, but they often don't really meet the expectations of the medical or regulatory community, as observed by some of the quotes on the screen here. For instance, we need more robust and well-designed clinical studies prior to making recommendations to our patients, and that's just from August 2020. And this lack of evidence leads to higher prescriber hesitancy, where the confidence in the medical community and for patients, for that matter, around dosing or an administration of cannabis medicine just isn't there today. And there's low levels of education and awareness, which leads to patients themselves having to self-educate, having to self-medicate, and likely experiencing a subpar outcome despite experiencing some benefits as well, of course. There are also fewer reimbursement mechanisms where payers and insurance companies lack the data they need to include products on formularies or to make a health economics case for higher reimbursement. So for these reasons, there is really a growing emphasis on the development of pharmaceutical-grade cannabis that more conclusively demonstrates the benefit of these products and the safety in specific disease contexts. And there are several companies that are racing to meet these evidence expectations. GW Pharma may be known to many of you. They've grown to a market cap of almost $4 billion now. Excuse me. And they are really true leaders in this field, but there are others following in a variety of disease areas as shown on the screen. And it's of course to deliver improved health outcomes for their patients, but it's also to capture what is potentially a very attractive business opportunity. And some have even forecasted this market to be as large as the recreational market by the end of the decade at about $50 billion. But if companies are really going to get full value from their efforts, we feel they need to think strategically about product strategy, considering areas of relevance, whether their product is focused on truly relevant needs of patients and health systems now and in the future, whether they've sufficiently differentiated the product's attributes in a manner that is recognized by payers and systems and patients so that people turn to that specific product, and whether they thought through the actions they can take to get their product to market as fast as possible. So these are some of the strategic questions that pharma always considers, of course, and we feel would be valuable to consider in the context of cannabis-based pharmaceuticals. And I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into these three areas and consider some of the nuances for this particular field. So beginning with increasing relevance. And how can we increase it in the cannabis space? Well, for one, I think that we have to focus here more on, at least initially, on underserved and highly niche areas to avoid competition with traditional pharmaceutical products, at least for now, because the medical community is more familiar and more comfortable with these more traditional products. So if we focus on drug-resistant patient segments or areas where there are low levels of innovation or options, that might be a more near-term opportunity, like Zynerba Pharmaceuticals, for instance. They're prioritizing orphan diseases like Fragile X syndrome, where there just really isn't any innovation to turn to in the medical community. We also, uniquely for this space, have to factor in the potential of patients turning to options in the traditional medical cannabis space. So being able to self-medicate with likely less expensive, potentially more accessible and familiar medical cannabis products. So areas where you want to have complete and full confidence in a product, where you wouldn't want to and be willing to substitute for a less proven product in the medical cannabis market, would likely be a priority. And that's the case, for example, like a company like Caliterra. They're focusing on solutions for graft versus host disease. And that's a very potentially deadly condition that you wouldn't want to necessarily treat with a product that hasn't been proven to work in that particular setting. There's also the potential for precision medicine opportunities. And there are emerging genetic markers that are demonstrating or predicting, I should say, patient responses to cannabis. And Global Genetics, just as an example, are providing genetic markers to determine an individual's sensitivity to THC and the propensity to experience adverse events, for instance. So taking these into consideration would be potential ways to increase the relevance of these products for patients. So turning to increasing the recognition of cannabis-based pharmaceuticals. So traditionally, pharma companies will develop what is known as target product profiles, and that's describing the ideal attributes of their product across the dimensions that are listed on the slide here. And for cannabis innovators, there are some unique considerations, like for formulation, for instance. There are over 100 cannabinoids and complex terpene profiles associated with the plants, and each may have applicability in different disease settings. So the careful selection of the cannabinoid profile for a particular condition must be considered. And for example, Emerald is using a modified THC that is more water soluble so that they can increase the penetration in the eye to relieve intraocular pressure. There's also the potential for attractive delivery devices that could form not only unique intellectual property, but also benefit patients at the end of the day. But we need to consider the real world use of these combinations to make sure that they are truly value adding for patients in the setting that they would use these products. Like Botanics, for instance, that is using a novel transdermal drug delivery technology, which was acquired to deliver cannabinoids more effectively through the skin to treat dermatological conditions. And finally, in this section, I mentioned earlier the reliability and quality in administration schedules are known issues among the medical community. And if we can really enhance that trust in a product by demonstrating consistent and rigorous manufacturing of a particular product and evidence-based dosing schedules that are known to be effective for a particular population. And GW Pharmaceuticals has done that, delineating a clear titration schedule for its product Epidiolex for the treatment of pediatric forms of epilepsy. So that evidence has garnered trust, and the medical community and patients are now willing to turn to that product versus any other options that are on the market at a much higher cost. And last I mentioned around rapidity that I wanted to touch on. It's interesting because the cannabis industry offers the potential for some unique business models and the opportunities to de-risk development and accelerate the time to market. And even in the preclinical stages, given the traditional medical cannabis market exists, it actually offers options for companies to launch products, gain real-world experience from them before adapting and launching into high-cost and risky clinical trial processes. That just isn't available to traditional pharma companies. And companies like Zelira Therapeutics out of Australia have employed this model that they call launch, learn, and develop to do just that. Innovators can also likely de-risk development and confidently proceed past phase 1, which isn't always the case for pharmaceutical companies. There's such a long known history of cannabis that the safety of the product is fairly well known, and independent organizations like McMaster Center for Medical Cannabis Research has done very systematic reviews to demonstrate or to conclude that CBD is indeed, as an example, is indeed safe. And then in terms of manufacturing and scale up and speed to which you do this, there are options that for synthetic cannabinoid development. And there are potential trade-offs with what is known as the entourage effect, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts of the cannabis plant to deliver better beneficial outcomes. But there are trade-offs, of course, in terms of having to have grow plants and extract products, whereas the synthetic platforms allow for rapid scale up at a lower cost. And InMed, for example, is using a proprietary E. coli-based platform to develop a more rare cannabinoid, CBN, and produce it at a scale that is amenable to clinical trials. But of course, there's also a need to align, at least today, with agencies like the DEA in the US who are still required to approve clinical studies in the US related to cannabis use. So there is some coordination among different regulatory bodies that may be required. So just to conclude very quickly, I believe the value of cannabis-based pharmaceuticals can be maximized by increasing the relevance of products by focusing on niche areas, factoring in the propensity to self-medicate. We can increase the recognition by putting forward very distinguishing product profiles that are, and I think, and very importantly, customized to the disease needs and the patient needs to move the community to specific products. And then finally, increasing the rapidity by thinking through innovative forms of business models and opportunities to de-risk development as much as possible in order to accelerate the development timelines. So I hope that that presentation provides everyone with a sense for some of the nuances of the cannabis product development, and I very much look forward to hearing everyone's expert opinion on these thoughts and otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was excellent. We really have an excellent panel today. So what I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do is I'm going to ask them just to provide a brief introduction to themselves and their involvement in this medical cannabis space, and maybe very, very briefly just touch on maybe a comment on what Chris has said and how it relates to your industry, and then we'll go into some deeper questions. There is a Q&A function on this, so if you have some questions, I will endeavor to try and get to some of them today. I can't promise to get to them all. I noticed there's well over 100 people online today, so so it's going to be a bit of a managing trick, but hopefully the information we can provide and with some of those questions will be useful. So Jeremy Desai, I'll ask you perhaps to, if you could introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your involvement in the industry.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Desai. I'm the CEO of Mandara Pharma, which is a Toronto-registered company that we set up in 2018, very much focused in the way that Chris has just described, of developing cannabinoid pharmaceutical products that would go through the classical stages of drug development, preclinical, clinical, regulatory approval and launch for specific disease indications. And I think Chris has teed it up very nicely in the sense that for these products to really get acceptability and penetration in these disease states, we do need to go through the classical steps of drug development. There's no question about that. And again, as Chris alluded to, thus far, the science has been very limited, very patchy. Quality of product manufacturing has been hit and miss. And certainly there's been very limited, what we would call registrable clinical trials to demonstrate safety and efficacy. And again, that's changing now, but thus far, very few companies have gone through those steps. But the way we've looked at it in Mandara Pharma, and my background is from the pharmaceutical industry. I've spent over 35 years in what we call traditional big pharma, the likes of the Glaxo and the Roches of this world, generic pharma, Ivax, Apotex, to name two, and really utilizing that broad-based pharmaceutical experience, and says, yes, to us, the cannabinoid is an API, an active pharmaceutical ingredient, but it has its own unique challenges, its own unique characteristics. But if we can actually characterize those cannabinoids and the profiles properly, what we're going to do is then take those through the classic stages of drug development that we've all been exposed to and had experience to, and take those through for regulatory approval, whether it's FDA, Health Canada, EMA, TGA in Australia, etc. So in many ways, there's a lot of similarity in the what we've learned in the pharmaceutical industry that we can now apply by taking a cannabinoid product through the drug development process. That being said, there are unique nuances, and I think Chris alluded to those. One of the things that, and it's almost a double-edged sword, because there is a lot of data out in cannabis and cannabinoids because of the usage in the non-regulated arena, if you will. And that's good, but then cannabis, and we can utilize that, but then cannabis has its own taboo and its own baggage and its own journey that it's going to. And how do we actually strip away the negativity around cannabis and focus on the golden nuggets, what I call the cannabinoids? And I very much like to use the fact that we're not developing cannabis-based products, we're developing cannabinoids, which are components of cannabis. As soon as you start talking about cannabis, you sometimes verge onto the negative connotations associated with that. Now, but the other advantage, I think, for a pharma company like Mandara is that we have the ability to use data analytics and data collection that's been set up. We've set up a research agreement with a Toronto-based company, Strainprint. I think you're going to hear from one of the principals on the panel. where we utilize their data to help us to target the indication that we want to pursue, but B, more importantly, we can zone in on the actual formulation, where using data analytics, albeit from the non-regulated industry, we've been able to actually zone in on what do we believe is our target area for THC content, secondary cannabinoids, tertiary cannabinoids, what terpenes should go into the formulations and what terpenes should come out of the formulations. So data analytics in this particular instance is a great advantage that can help us to accelerate to get us to preclinical and the clinical stages. The other part I think is very important, and again, Chris talked about is drug delivery. I mean, today in the non-regulated space, the formulations are very crude, unsophisticated, I would say. Now we have the opportunity to look at opportunities of more sophisticated drug delivery, whether it's through transdermal, whether it's just through oral delivery using proprietary technology to enhance the bioavailability, for example. And again, from a company point of view, if we can somehow link a specific cannabinoid profile with a specific method of delivery to a specific method of use, you have the opportunity, I think David would, one of our panelists will talk about it, to generate valuable intellectual property to build the value of your overall offering. So what we've done is taken traditional pharmaceutical drug development, applying other areas to accelerate, like data analytics, to accelerate to getting to the pivotal studies, and then ultimately making sure that through each step of the way, and as Chris rightly said, is to validate the assumptions that we are really pursuing the right market with the right relevance, because there is no question there is a role of these products in medicine if we do these things properly in the way that pharmaceutical medicines, traditional pharmaceutical medicines, have been developed over the years. So on that, I think hopefully that gives a kind of a flavor of what we're doing and how we are putting really Chris's strategy into operation, really.
Yeah,
so thank you very much.
That's really great, Jeremy, and we'll come back to some of those themes. David Berg, would you like to introduce yourself? Maybe also give a bit more of a flavor of the kind of, they mentioned about Strainprint, so kind of data, and give a flavor of how, what you think about the industry and where the data is going at the moment.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is David Berg, and I'm the president and CTO of Strainprint. We're a data and analytics company in the medical and recreational cannabis space, but we're a medical, we collect data in a very unique way, I should say. I started off in the technology industry along with some of my founders, spent about 20 years there developing software for security agencies and large enterprise. About 5 years ago, I got involved in cannabis, predominantly driven by my younger son who developed a chronic disease. I went to the hospital for sick children to talk to his physician about using an augmented cannabinoid therapy because I had done some research that it works quite well in certain circumstances. And I was told that there was no chance that would even be considered because there was not enough information about the way it interacted specifically in pediatric cases or for inflammatory autoimmune diseases. So went and did some research and realized that there were about 30,000 academic references in PubMed for cannabis and related therapies. Unfortunately, about 29,000 of those references were seen as looking at harms. And we all know from personal experience or from observing others that cannabis can be a transformational medicine. Sadly today, it's a lot of the time it's a last line of defense when it really should be looked at as something for primary care and for holistic health. So the way that we went about grabbing this data or capturing it was we developed a mobile application that we provide for free to patients, physicians, regulators, and anyone in the supply chain that wants to track how they use cannabis products. These are lab verified products against their personal situation. And we track about 300 different medical conditions or associated symptoms. And then patients tell us about before they treat, how are they feeling after they take a specific product with a chemical composition. Because Jeremy and Chris mentioned that there's hundreds of cannabinoids, there's hundreds of terpenes, there's 450 chemicals that are bioaccessible in the cannabis plant. So it's important to know how these chemicals differ, how they're dosed, and what the outcome is for your personal circumstance. Because again, cannabis is a very personalized medicine. So we can gather that data, and once we gathered a large mass of that data, we're approaching 2 million interactions now. We can start to see patterns in the data as we isolate individual users and groups and disease states. And what that does is it starts to tell us when we apply machine learning or multivariate statistics against the data set, we can start to see, you know, is CBN actually helping people sleep? Is cannabigerol actually helping to reduce bowel inflammation? These are things that we're starting to look at and understand. Similarly, when we hear about people talking about entourage effect or ensemble effect, it's a matter of starting to understand what are the cannabinoids and terpenes used in concentration or isolation that are leading to these measured and repeatable outcomes. So, I mean, we feel quite fortunate in where we sit in the industry because we get to see how products from across the supply chain impact people. The data that we gather is 100% privacy compliant and anonymized. And what we do with it is we work with physicians, we work with companies like Mandara Pharma, we work with regulators like Health Canada, and we work with parties like that on a global basis to help them to understand how to use cannabis more effectively. So one of the things that's quite interesting is that through this process and this analysis, we've been able to help pharmaceutical companies and therapeutic companies to not only develop natural plant or modified spectrum products, but we've also worked on biosynthetics. And synthetics in this case tend to have a negative connotation, but a lot of what's going on in the industry is around biosynthetics, which is actually using medium like yeast, like algae, like microbes to manufacture these plant-based components. Because a lot of the precursors are held in the algae or the yeast. And what that does is it's bringing predictability, it's bringing consistency, it's bringing shelf stability to cannabinoids in a plant-based medicine that's otherwise difficult to control and stabilize. So through the power of data, we're informing, we are teaching pharmacists and doctors and patients how to more effectively use cannabis and ultimately how to formulate purpose-built products. I hope I answered your question, Allison.
You did, thank you. And we'll be coming back and circling back on some of those notions in a minute. So David Wood, maybe I could ask you to introduce yourself. I mean, some of the things that have been brought out, you know, if you think about the companies, the work that Germany's doing, supported by data that David Berg is providing, but ultimately as a company, you need to protect your business. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about what you do and also kind of where you're going with the industry in terms of helping them protect their business in terms of intellectual property or other things that you may think are useful.
Thank you. Happy to. Good morning, and thanks for having me. My name is David Wood. I'm a lawyer and patent agent. I practice from the Calgary office of Borden Ladner Gervais, which is why it's still very, very dark here. And we're over in Calgary. And I've been a lawyer for 12 years. I've been a patent agent for 7. And I'm the start of my career was mostly patent litigation and patent prosecution. Patent prosecution means helping people get patents. And by working in both the litigation side and the prosecution side at the start of my career, I got a really good perspective of what happens when you actually enforce these rights, which has really informed how I draft them. Prior to law school, I completed a PhD in structural biochemistry, and my PhD had a lot of organic chemistry, protein engineering, genetics, plant metabolism, and physical chemistry in it, which was a really good background for talking to people who are innovating at different parts of the supply chain. So I really like to think of this industry, and when I say industry, I mean the cannabis industry, which would be adult use products that are either sold adult use, sold medically in Canada, same group of products, or drugs containing cannabis, which we don't see a lot of in Canada. On my memory, without really double checking, I believe Sativex is only available in Nova Scotia, and Epidiolex, I don't think it's available anywhere. And that's probably because we have little bottles like this that, you know, in a certain way will compete with it. The light blew that out pretty badly, but that was a bottle of CBD cannabis oil. So I came into the industry in 2016, shortly after receiving medical access myself, when I realized that I would be purchasing cannabis from a publicly traded company whose stock price is almost back down to where it was back then. I thought, okay, well, they have a lawyer, you know, that this is an industry. So BLG sent me to Oakland to the first trade show where I saw a vape pen, saw regulated edibles, spoke to some operators, met some Canadian companies that were down there. And it was at that point that, well, I realized all of these companies ought to be conscious of intellectual property, and a lot of them ought to directly commercialize it and file patent applications themselves. Not all of them knew that. So there was a certain component of educating people about why they need an IP lawyer, even if they're not going to build their own portfolio. What I realized, though, is that 100% of these companies were very much alive to the need for advice that was either regulatory in nature or commercial or other advice that had to be consistent with the regulations to work. So I immediately, after that conference, started learning regulatory law, and now skip forward 4.5 years, and cannabis and restricted drug or other controlled substance regulatory law is as big a part of my practice as intellectual property law. So to bring it back to your question about how people can protect their assets in this, I'd like to kind of talk about regulations and intellectual property at the same time. And Chris made a point that I loved, and that's that cannabis is unique in a whole bunch of ways. And the way Canada has chosen to regulate cannabis, which is as a completely unique product category, in some ways analogous to the way tobacco is a unique product category, although in a clearly very different way for very different reasons. It's interesting because we don't really have another product category, you know, that could be a beverage, or that could be a vaping product, or that could just be dried flower, right? There isn't really another category of consumer packaged good in Canada like that, which is also strongly psychoactive. And as a result of that psychoactivity, we have to give it special rules and regulations. We really don't regulate alcohol that way. And we don't have any other consumer packaged goods that are what I'd call strongly psychoactive. I mean, coffee is psychoactive, tobacco is psychoactive, but I would say cannabis and alcohol are strongly psychoactive, which distinguishes them. And with cannabis, we don't pretend it's food. People are buying it because it's psychoactive. And while that may be true with alcohol, we all kind of pretend that it's food, and we more or less treat it that way, other than where it's sold. You can't buy cannabis in restaurants, not yet anyway. So cannabis is this unique thing that we regulate in a way that is conscious of the fact that it is pharmaceutically active. It does change how you feel. It does change how you perceive. And because of that, it's got special rules. As Chris pointed out, and again, I love this idea, is you can take a product and you can put it on the market and you can sell it to people. And Chris said in medical streams, I'd say skip the medical part, just sell it to people. Who cares, right? And if you're getting data, that's awesome. You'll get better data if people are using David Berg's app and using it medically for a particular reason. But I'd say that if you really just want observational study data, I mean, you can link that as much to products that people buy in the store or from the online cannabis authority if they're willing to fill out the app, you know, because people will go to these stores and buy things for their own medical purposes without involving their doctors. And again, in that way, cannabis feels a little bit more like a natural health product. And we likely will see cannabis health products coming out soon. I'm sure everyone here is conscious that there's a consultation going on right now to do that. And cannabis health products will differ from these products in that cannabis products as they are today cannot have a health claim on the box, and there are serious consequences for companies that choose to make health claims about them. Whereas cannabis health products will require a health claim, much like a traditional natural health product, and will have a broader list of ingredients that can be included, like other vitamins or other actives that might synergize with cannabis, and we see a lot of that down in California, Colorado, and other US states where regulations are far looser. So all that to say, if one wants to bring a product to market, there are two big things that are important to recoup that investment. One is patent rights, so that you have a monopoly and market exclusivity to recoup all those clinical trial costs. And the other is regulatory approval, which takes a long time and eats into that patent term. If a particular cannabis drug product is consistent with the regulations that apply to cannabis products, which means, you know, it doesn't have many other ingredients that are active, then it could be sold on the market in Canada, as likely in the cannabis extract or cannabis topical category, before it's approved. As long as the formulation works in those categories, data could be collected. And then as soon as it's available, as soon as it gets regulatory approval, because there's clinical trials happening at the same time, then the adult use or medical products can stop, and the pharmaceutical drug products that have a DIN and are approved can start, and likely at a much higher price point because they're being reimbursed by insurance now. And again, the leveraging the fact that these products are available to consumers outside the context of a clinical trial just means data comes in quicker. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer.
That's great. And I think actually it brings up a question that I want to pose to Jeremy about, and that also came up, I think, from one of our questions about this idea about how does this influence what David said about how the regulations are in Canada, potentially a corporate strategy in terms of pharmaceutical grade development. Because is there a potential, for example, for your product, if you're going through a long regulatory piece, other people are releasing on earlier with certain claims, does it still provide the issue that the doctors in the end are not sure that the product is meeting the regulatory bar, even though it might get a DIN in the end? So I think I'm just wondering if you feel that some of that could confuse your corporate strategy.
Yeah, it's a good point. And the problem at the moment, and the way I see it, is no different if you kind of go back 30 years ago when generic pharmaceuticals started making their entrance globally. And at that point, different jurisdictions had different regulations, and people were not quite sure that the way you develop a product in Australia is different in Europe, and Canada was different to the US, et cetera, et cetera. And those guidances, those regulations are evolving as we speak. And so there's going to be a time where there is going to be regulatory convergence. But at this point in time, there are differing views. And I'll give you an example. Today, I would say the most advanced, I would say tier 1 regulatory jurisdiction around cannabis and cannabinoid products is Australia, the TGA. And the TGA have been mandated by the Australian government to accelerate market access for cannabinoid-derived products supported by clinical trials. And in their effort to do so, they've set up what we call a progressive regulatory pathway, where they were likely to give an approval based on a phase 2, maybe a phase 1 study, supported by literature data and safety data that can be obtained through the public domain. And then with those approval, as I think Chris gave an example, you launch a product and then you start learning more about the product, and then you have a fixed time to do a phase 3 study. And if you do that and it's great, your approval will continue, and if not, it will get rescinded. That's very progressive, very unique. EU, on the other hand, are very much focusing at the moment on the manufacturing side and the GMP side, because they want to make sure that products that are coming through, even for the medicinal categories, are manufactured in plants which have a EU GMP certification. Canada are somewhat like with many things with pharmaceutical regulation, they sometimes watch and wait. And yes, primarily at the moment, the guidances in cannabis are through the GAP, the Good Agricultural Practices, although they now are talking about making sure that plants, manufacturing facilities, at least are at the same standard as a non-sterile pharmaceutical plant. In other words, something that you would manufacture for oral dosage forms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But again, they're still slightly behind. So in a nutshell, there are differing, and FDA, as we all know, they still are struggling. Yes, there is a drug approval pathway that GW used with Epidiolex, but still, because of the lack of federal legislation, it's still very complicated. So, but again, this will all converge over time, and companies and like Strainprint and others, the likes of Chris and other pharma companies, need to be part of that debate and dialogue to start shaping up regulatory policy. Because otherwise, we could end up with a very diverse set, and it's very then difficult for a company to have a global development strategy then.
That's great. Thanks, Jeremy. You know, David Berg, that you know, over the last few years, patient-centered research is a really important way that a lot of companies have developed better products. And given what you do, which is totally patient-centered from what I can determine from what you were saying, what do you think their role is really in advancing more rigorous pharmaceutical cannabis products? Are they pushing for more data themselves on understanding how it's affecting them and helping them with their diseases?
Yeah, thank you, Alison. That's a great question. I mean, one of the things that all consumers or patients have when they walk into a dispensary, or when they take that medical approach and they go see a physician at a clinic and get diagnosed and prescribed or issued a document, is they in Canada at least, the physician or the caregiver is muted by regulation. They're not allowed to give any product recommendations or any products. So literally what the doctor will say is, you might want to look at a CBD dominant product, or keep the THC below 12%, reducing risk of things like psychosis or anxiety or paranoia. But take those rules of thumb, start low, go slow, figure out how you feel. They have to take that type of information and then translate that into, okay, I'm gonna go onto a website and they've got maybe 20 products. If I go onto Ontario Cannabis Store, there might be 200 products. Now I've got to figure out which is the best one for my anxiety, and what is the best one for my stomach issues. There's really no guidance. So what doctors tell you to do is to journal. So cannabis is a personalized medicine. Everyone has, it regulates your endocannabinoid system. You have CB1, CB2 receptors, and it's also highly susceptible to hormonal swings. So we see not only differences in products between different symptoms, genders, but we also see a shift in products as it pertains to your age. As you age, as dopamine levels change, as estrogen levels change, as testosterone level changes, the way that individuals relate to those products change. So what in effect we're doing is we're grabbing observational data in very large quantities. We're mapping that to chemical data, which we obtain directly from the manufacturers through their C of A's, which are their lab reports. And then we analyze so that we understand, going back to what Chris started off talking about what are the relevant needs of the patients? How are people using cannabis and why? Where are they getting the best outcomes? How much are they using? When are they using it? Once we do that, we can recognize who the players are, who the producers are that are producing that medicine or those genetics or those compounded products that are providing the highest efficacy, and doing so rapidly so we can get out next generation solutions to consumers and patients that would otherwise have to fumble around in the dark and figure it out. So by doing all of that and collecting that, we can take that construct, that observational data, we can take that and put it into a processor or a developer that is EU GMP certified, and to help them to build proven solutions for patients. So it's taking that data, helping to translate that consumer experience into products that can be rendered in a pharmaceutical way or in a way that a biotechnology company is used to be responsive to market.
Thank you, David. And before I go to David, so Jeremy, do you see, because you said you've got a relationship, do you see then that data as being foundational to moving on with clinical trials and being able to differentiate kind of how you're going to develop your very highly rigorous, say, a phase 2, phase 3 clinical trial based on some of the data that might come out of Strainprint?
Absolutely. We have taken the Strainprint data almost as a de-risking tool and de-risking strategy, because as it's been said already, it's like finding a needle in the haystack. And when you're trying to find what is the right cannabinoid profile, what's the right terpenes, and trying to manage those 450 different chemicals. So what we've done is really using the data to minimize any surprises once we enter into the pivotal studies. So A, it helps us to accelerate the drug development timelines. B, it reduces risk. And C, it reduces cost.
Right, thank you. So David Wood, I mean, this is all interesting. Some people, I think you've already mentioned that there's some consultation in the NHP regulations going on around this area. But could you also speak to, there are some pharmaceutical products already out there, I suppose, not very many. There's definitely recreational products, as we just talked about. What may be the role of device and delivery technologies in actually helping you also do formulations in terms of protecting your product as the field gets wider? There is a lot of cannabinoids, but there's going to be lots of prior art out there. And maybe someone else mentioned that if you release it early onto the recreational market, as you're developing the pharmaceutical, is this going to affect your patent rights?
Great questions. To start with the last one, as long as your patent applications are filed before the product's released in any market, then you're good. I mean, the patent has a 20-year term, starting from when it's filed. And if part of that term, it's that monopoly is being applied to an adult use product or a product that's either sold medically or sold adult use, because they're the same products, then that's fine. You have a patent on that, whatever it happens to be, whether that's a piece of hardware or a particular formulation or a particular dosage form. Again, though, what you can do in pharmaceuticals is considerably broader in the possibilities, more rigorous in the manufacturing standards compared with what you can do with cannabis products. Right? You can't put other pharmaceuticals in a cannabis product. You could do that with a drug containing cannabis. So patent rights, no problem. And then with devices, I mean, probably the most relatable device is a concentrate pen, right? Like I wouldn't say this would ever become something that would make sense as a per se medical device, but something that looks like it and feels like it and that you use in the same way could be. And there's more than one company that's offering dose-controlled concentrate pens. And I would think that to the extent that's ever a realistic option for an actual drug product, and I defer to Jeremy on that one, if it were, I'm sure it would be dose controlled. And I'm sure, and I mean, I've seen many different dose control concentrate pens, and they, you know, they all work in different ways and they all be patentable in different ways. So that's one type of hardware that might make sense. I suppose another one would be some sort of portable dispenser. Transdermal products that disrupt the skin are not allowed in Canada. Topicals are, but not if they disrupt the skin. But some sort of patch, you know, the patch itself would be considered a medical device. Mm-hmm. The cannabis inside would be the drug. So that, I suppose it's another strategy for locking down IP rights, where you can have a monopoly on a product that's a combination product, which means a medical device plus a drug, even if you don't have a monopoly on the drug itself. The weakness of that approach is that once your data exclusivity is gone, assuming you ever had any, it opens the field for others to compete with you by changing the delivery system, but not the payload.
Right. So we're getting close to time. So just a couple of things. One, I'll ask generally the same question. There are a couple of questions, Jeremy, coming in about GMP status for these drugs, especially if they're coming from the plant side. And how you manage. I will say there are some drugs out there from other plants, not cannabis plants, that are actually where they use the plant as a vehicle to make a drug, and they are GMP regulated and everything. So it can happen. I'm not sure about the cannabis side. Maybe Jeremy, you just want to comment quickly, and maybe why people are thinking about synthetics, which is what Chris mentioned. But maybe I could ask you to quickly answer that, but also just very briefly, just touch on, where do you see, if we're 5 years from now and we're talking about these medical grade cannabis products, where do you see the physicians and the patients being, and in terms of how acceptable they are, given that there's been a huge rise in amount of activity in this space in the last 5+ years, in the last 5, where do you see us in the next 5 years? So Jeremy, maybe I could ask you to answer that.
Yep. So answer the first question, as long as you follow GMPs, so if your input active material is manufactured to GMP and you follow all whether it's Health Canada or Australia or EU FDA, then you're okay. So there's no issue as long as you follow the GMPs. And at the moment, obviously Europe have got a very sophisticated inspection process that they go out auditing the facilities like any other pharma facilities. So they've gone recently into Colombia, which is one of our partners, and they've gone and approved the first EU approved GMP manufacturing facility out of Colombia. So that's not the issue. Looking forward, it's going to be, again, based on good science and good data and good products. And in my view, the longevity in this space, there will always be a space for medicinal usage, no question. And as legislation opens up around the world, people will turn to that. But the real acceptability of a cannabinoid product in frontline medicine, either frontline therapy, second line therapy, will only happen based on good science, good data, advocacy, safety, quality, and efficacious products, like any other pharmaceutical product in any new or existing indication.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's a good lead in, I think, to David Berg.
I guess one of the things that I would also add is when we're looking at the processes that are being used to bring these products to market, we're starting with the plant and we're using pharmaceutical processes or chemical processes for extraction, whether that's using CO2, whether that's using hydrocarbon or ethanol extraction to render the products into a more purified format. We are further cleansing it through distillation or fractionalization. And then in some cases, so that's transforming the plant into a specific product. The other thing that's happening that is going to protect these companies is the way that they process that product. So the question about, well, how can you smoke and why is that an acceptable process? David Wood showed us a vape cartridge. The reality is understanding bioaccessibility of formats and the way that your body ingests. The fact remains that smoking cannabis or vaporizing cannabis is one of the most effective ways to metabolize the product because you get the broadest spectrum and it's heated, it's absorbed through the lungs, and that's why it works so well. Oils, on the other hand, have a completely different onset and offset that are better for longer duration. Understanding similarly that certain components are gonna make you tired versus awake. And then finally, what's coming out right now, you see it a lot in the beverage industry, you see it a lot in topicals and transdermals, is emulsive processing. So this is really changing the landscape and taking it from here's a standardized plant to now here's a very specific, specialized, purpose-built product and delivery mechanism that I can protect, package, and deliver.
Thanks, David Berg. And David Wood, what would be your final comments? I know we're running close to time, but what would your final comments be? Oh, David, we've lost your audio.
Sorry, I forgot. Yeah, I am now. You know, just that there's an enormous amount of potential here. It's difficult to define controls. It's difficult to pick what you're actually calling your API. And it's going to be its own, I'd say, its own subset within botanical drugs, and there's just a unique set of factors here when you're setting up a trial, and a lot of them come from the fact that it's quite strongly psychoactive in most cases, and even when it's high CBD, it's still somewhat psychoactive, and then also the fact that there is this entourage effect that one way or another you're going to have to account for, and that could be by going straight down to single or 2 or 3 API total, nothing else, or it could be by betting on a particular extract and then deciding how you're going to characterize that relative to control. So there's a lot of potential, there's new challenges, and we'll figure them out. Like it's just a matter of time and effort.
Right. Well, I want to say thank you for that. I want to say thank you to all of you. We could clearly do a whole morning session on this, not just an hour. So I do apologize that I rushed through some of the discussion. But thank you all very much. We do appreciate it. I think it's an incredibly exciting field. I'm going to pass the mic now to Jason Field from LSO, and he's just got a few final comments to make.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Chris, Jeremy, and David. That was a fantastic presentation. A few quick announcements. Later today, we're hosting another webinar. One wasn't enough per day, so we're doing 2. And this one is about a couple of new reports that LSO commissioned, talking about some new survey data around 2 surveys that we did. One was an industry survey of pharmaceutical companies with regards to the impacts of the new PMPRB federal regulations, and the other one is a broader general public survey, polling survey that we did with Ipsos Canada that reflects what Canadians are looking for in terms of the priorities of the cost of medicines versus access. Some very interesting findings, so please join us at 1 p.m. and we'll have the authors present to walk us through some of those findings. Our annual gala, which is February every year for the last couple of decades, unfortunately, we have had to postpone the actual awards ceremony because of the new restrictions. It's really prevented us from having our videographer connect with the awardees and with others to put together the video presentation. So we are postponing that event until the fall. However, we are not going to miss this opportunity to connect with our friends, our colleagues, as we do every February. So please join us for some virtual networking on the evening of February 24th at 7 p.m. We're going to have a lot of fun, and it's a free event to attend and a great opportunity to connect with your colleagues. Finally, a thank you to our corporate sponsors, our platinum sponsors, Alexion, Pfizer, Silicon Valley Bank, Horizon, Shift Health, Sanofi, PR Associates, Innovative Medicines Canada, and Merck. Our gold sponsors, Taiho, Admire, Antibody, Stryker, and Biotalent Canada. And our silver sponsors, EY, Roche, BDO, CRB, and the Arts and Science Co-op at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. I want to thank you all for attending and joining us. We had a great group of participants. And one last thought I wanted to leave you with. You know, many of us are struggling right now with the new lockdown restrictions in place. And even before these were in place, you know, it has been a long haul since March of last year. So many of us are struggling. And, you know, I would say to all of you, take care of your mental health, talk to family and friends. We're all in this together. We're all experiencing times where it's really tough. So do some yoga, get out, walk your dog, whatever you need to do to take care of your mental health. It's really important that you do that while maintaining the public health restrictions that are in place. Stay safe, stay healthy, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.